Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for the fun topic of racism. I appreciate you being here. So I thought what I would do is I would give you some insight into how I think about racism, how it influenced the decision to come into the VR space, which is completely new for me, and to share some of the lessons I think we've learned over the past year in terms of taking this on. I have to say I wasn't convinced I was excited about the possibility of doing this, but I wasn't convinced that VR was the right place for me to think about how to represent racism. So I've tried to be very kind of critical and thoughtful about that. And then I'll leave hopefully plenty of time for discussion. I'm interested in your thoughts about what we're already doing and where we might go next. So I like this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates that says, "But for all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it lodges brains, blocks our airways, tips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body." So I am a social scientist. I'm trained as a psychologist, steeped in empirical approaches to try and document what racism is and document its effects on health. And I also know that that data doesn't always do justice to the reality of these experiences. I also know that that data doesn't always land and stick with people, that people don't always meaningfully engage that data and are sometimes dismissive of some of the patterns that we observe both empirically and also in terms of journalistic pieces, personal narratives that people share. So I started to wonder whether VR might be a way, right? Could I create some kind of gut punch that would wake people up and make them engage these types of issues differently? Really building on the premise that understanding and addressing racial inequality requires that we understand racism. And I consistently find that we don't understand racism, that we throw around key words like bias and microaggressions. We might even say structural racism, but we don't actually know what that means. We don't really engage with the complexities of racial inequality in this country, in our public discourse, and I would argue even sometimes in our science. And so how might I help push our understanding and our dialogues to a deeper, more substantial place? So that really is rooted in answering that question. What is racism? How might we think about it? There's some things that come to mind that we all agree about, right? This is racism. That's white supremacy. Everyone pretty much agrees about that. It's taking modern forms, the alt-right, et cetera. But that tends to lead us, when we only think about racism in that way, we think, well, I would never go to a meeting. I'd never put on a hood. So I'm not racist, right? And it becomes very narcissistic in a sense, right? As long as I'm not racist, then it's all good. As long as I can get a sticker that says, I'm not racist, concerns over, we can move on. But what I'm trying to do is push more people to a space of anti-racism, not just concerned with their individual designation of being racist or not. I'm trying to push more people to actively engage in the fight against racism, trying to get more people to engage in acts that push us closer to racial justice. Also, it's important to note that racism is more complex than one's individual designation as being racist, our individual levels of bias, our willingness to attend meetings or wear hoods. It is rooted in our culture, in our systems, in our histories. And until we deal with racism and think about the problem in that way, we won't address and attempt to solve the problem at those levels and in those ways. So racism is also this form of white supremacy, right? Notions of beauty being based on notions of whiteness. The ways in which we comment on race in black bodies and brown bodies. So this is a white male in blackface dressed as Trayvon Martin for Halloween as a joke. The death of this child is somehow funny and warrants mocking in some ways. It's housing inequality, it's mass incarceration, it's pink pussy hats in white feminism, in intersections of race and gender, in ways in which the centering of whiteness and white experiences ignore variation in ways in other people experience reality in everyday life. It shows up in our language. So Paul Ryan blaming poverty on lazy inner city men, I would argue, is the use of racially coded language to elicit negative racial sentiment. Some people talk about this in the form of dog whistles, right? So it's trying to perk up and speak to particular ears. In the same article, Paul Ryan cites a scholar who argues that blacks are genetically inferior. Paul Ryan didn't say blacks are genetically inferior. He cites someone who does. It also shows up in the ways in which we apply structures and policies, the ways in which we've disenfranchised entire communities of people. This is an aide to Nixon who was talking about the initial efforts, the initial war on drugs in the 1970s, and he says, you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against, to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, Ehrlichman said, who's the aide. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this is an aide to the president talking about the use of federal policy to deliberately disenfranchise an entire community. That's structural and way more important than your individual level of bias, right? The impact that the use of federal, regional, et cetera, policies might have to deliberately target particular groups of people. Our application of drug policies differently for some people and some drugs than we apply to other groups and people and drugs have bigger impact, more long-lasting impact. And if we don't frame the problem this way, again, we won't attempt to address the problem at this level. We'll keep just trying to fix individual bias. There's also this misunderstanding of our historical legacy of racial oppression, right? We keep trying to shirk off the significance of American slavery, right? It's fascinating to me the degrees to which we're willing to let go of the logic that the past influenced the present when we come to talk about slavery. Why are we still talking about this? Because it still matters, right? I also see it in the reactions to data, right? So this is a series by Nicholas Kristof, which I thought was really fantastic. It was a series he called When Whites Just Don't Get It. It's not just whites who don't get it, by the way. But the reactions he got to this data, right? He's trying to provide data about mass incarceration and drug policies and housing discrimination, et cetera. And look at the reactions. Some of the reactions are probably has something to do with their unwillingness to work. We can't fix their problems. If blacks are poor and in prison, it's all their fault. We all start from zero. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of racial oppression in our country and the nature of racial inequality. And I hear these sorts of things all the time. I have, in this work, thought explicitly about targeting white liberals. And people ask me, why is that your target audience? It's my target audience because that is the group who is most likely to espouse beliefs of racial justice and equity, but may not fully understand racial injustice and inequity. They may not really understand how this infiltrates every part of people's lives and has real implications for their mobility, their health, et cetera. So among those who espouse beliefs of racial justice and acknowledge realities of injustice, both of those things are necessary, I would argue, how do we move more of us from superficial fluency in racial terminology, microaggressions, bias, those words we throw around to identify ourselves as woke liberal people, to more substantive knowledge and meaningful engagement around issues of race and racism? And can immersive VR help improve our understanding of racial inequality? Might this be a tool to help us dig a little deeper and push beyond this sort of surface level ideology? So I worked in collaboration with the team at Stanford University, the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. Jeremy Bailenson has been my partner on this. And I have to say, when I started started developing this idea, might I be able to use VR in this way, I had never used VR. I wasn't even clear exactly what it was and what all it could do. I just thought the adage of being able to walk in someone else's shoes would be compelling, right, around this sort of issue. So cold email to Jeremy at Stanford and said, hey, you don't know me, but might you be willing to work with me on a project around racism? He was interested. We wrote a proposal and got funded to do our project from the Brown Institute of Media Innovation at the School of Journalism at Columbia. Those guys. I also like to emphasize that this work was very transdisciplinary. It really required people from multiple perspectives, areas of expertise coming together, Racism is a complicated and nasty problem. There's no one person, there's no one psychologist, no one sociologist, et cetera, who's going to solve the problem of racism. This is an all hands on deck type of problem. And it really required an interdisciplinary team. My students at the School of Social Work, which include psychologists, social workers, Jeremy's team, communication scholars, computer scientists. At the Brown Institute, we had creative technologists, artists, filmmakers, all kind of sitting with us and thinking through this problem together. So part of what I thought was important about approaching this work, and let me take a step back, which I realized I didn't include a slide for this. I'll tell you what we did for those of you who haven't experienced it. So what we created, this interdisciplinary team came together to create, is a life course experience from the perspective of a Black male. It's a computer-generated, first-person point of view experience where you become Michael Sterling. You're Michael Sterling at age 6 in his elementary school classroom. You're Michael Sterling at age 15 on the streets of Brooklyn having an encounter with the police. And you're Michael Sterling at age 30 in a workplace applying for a job. And we tried to bring in different data points, empirical data that documents work discrimination and stop and frisk practices in New York City, as well as personal narratives where people have actually gone through these sorts of things, including the people on my team, using that to create this very, very complex narrative. When we set out, like I said, I had a target audience in mind. The purpose was a little bit murky. It was more of an exploratory undertaking, as I said. Can we do this in a meaningful way that doesn't turn racism into a game or entertainment, right? Can we do this in the way where people don't take off the headset and say, now I know what it's like to be a Black man? Instead, ha ha ha. But instead, do they take off the headset and say, I had no idea. I thought I got this, I thought I understood this, and I had no idea. And could we do something about the ways in which people engage? I've made the argument that empathy is important, but it is insufficient, right? You feeling bad doesn't do anything for the public good. Your actions do things for the public good. Your ways of thinking and interpreting and thinking about data that comes across your desk become important. I think an important point is to note that even though we're using virtual reality, we're not saying anything that any of you shouldn't have already known and seen. We're not creating new realities. We're trying to represent reality in virtual reality. It shouldn't take all this. It shouldn't take the hundreds of thousands of dollars spent to try and create this experience and hours spent to help people pay attention and notice and be willing to engage. But in my experience, this felt like a necessary step. The work was also empirically based, as I said. So we took data about patterns of racism, what's effective in VR, which Jeremy has spent 20 years developing around social and behavioral uses of VR, what is a meaningful interactive experience, what is a meaningful story in VR, why this story in VR, and using that to really understand what would be a meaningful story. And also we'll start data collection on the experience we created later this summer, but what are we doing to people, right? There's sort of the speculation about what we might be doing. There's the things that people say to us as soon as they take off the headset, but how do they feel 3 weeks later? How do they feel 2 months later? How do they look compared to a baseline before they even go through the experience? And so that's part of some of what we'll develop on the empirical side. And again, taking a transdisciplinary approach. So a distinction between interdisciplinary work and transdisciplinary work is interdisciplinary work might take into consideration the perspectives of multiple disciplines or areas of expertise. I'm going to go talk to an economist, get their thoughts, and then go back and do my work. A transdisciplinary approach says we can't create something new unless all people are involved in the creation of the product, right? So unless I am involving a creative technologist, a computer scientist, a psychologist, and social worker, and we're sitting at the same table trying to create something new to solve the exact same problem, that is where this work has really been centered. Now it can be challenging to get people to give you money to do a project when you don't know what the project's going to be. But that's what this needed to be, right? This couldn't be something that I created in my head and then handed over to a team to create. It was really important that we create it together. And also, I was willing for VR not to be the way to go. I was willing to get this wrong. I was willing to, although that was terrifying, because it's not the type of thing I want to get wrong. But I was willing to create this project and learn that VR was not the space in which I wanted to engage to try and develop this kind of work. The process, like I said, was transdisciplinary, thinking about a confluence of expertise and perspectives. It was important for us to establish common ground empirically, so we wanted the team to pull from the same knowledge base. So we each had our areas of expertise, but we also did the same reading, looked at the same journal articles, watched the same videos to try and create a knowledge base from which we were all working. For some of us, this is a deeply personal experience, but it also doesn't mean, just because it's personal doesn't mean we understand the empirical literature. And so we needed to have that same kind of knowledge base from which to work. And then there was a question constantly about why this story in VR? Why is VR necessary to tell the particular story we're trying to tell? And Jeremy and his team pushed us a lot on this, because again, we barely understood what VR was. And I'll say, in some ways, that worked to our advantage. Because we were so naive, we would come up with things like, oh, can we do this? And they would say, no. And one, is not technically possible, or it's way too expensive. But in some ways, it also pushed us to be creative, to push the technology and think about what we could do. Because for us, we're coming from an experience-based and empirical base that says, this particular thing in VR is actually really important for representing the experience. How can we do it? How can we think about a creative solution for doing this? So our naivete, in some ways, actually worked to our advantage. So we created these really complex narratives. We wanted ways where you could interact with the experience. We actually filmed actors on green screen, 2D, and then rotoscoped and put them into the computer-generated environment. But the videos are also interactive. So for those of you who haven't done it, in the elementary school scene, when you throw the block, it hits a billboard, and then that triggers a video of your teacher saying, hey, you're being dangerous, you're going to hurt someone. Initially in the experience, although we shortened it for the Tribeca Film Festival, the police officers initially approach you. If you don't follow their instructions, they became more aggressive. So when they tell you to get down on your knees and put your hands up, if you look up at them in their face, they would become more aggressive. So that we were playing around with creative ways to use the video billboards along with the computer-generated environment to create the experience we wanted to create. The physicality was also an important component. So certainly in Jeremy's work, there's certain components of immersive VR that become really important to create a feeling of embodiment, to feel like the thing that's happening to that avatar is happening to you. One thing is mirrors, being able to see your face in a mirror. So we use mirrors at various points throughout, having to use the body you're in. So using the hand controllers or whatever technology you're using to grab, interact with objects in the space, and for us, getting down on your knees and putting your hands up. You are physically making an action in the real world that's consistent with what the avatar is doing, which we hope contributes to this feeling of embodiment. And we'll find out empirically if that's the case. Just another example. So I talked a little bit about the study that will start later this summer. So we're interested in gathering baseline measures before people know that the study has anything to do with race or racism. What are your baseline political ideologies? What are your beliefs about racial justice in society? What's your level of empathy? What's your level of racial bias, implicit racial bias? We'll get all those things at baseline. They'll come into the lab 2 weeks later. We'll measure those things again right after they go through the experience. We'll follow up with them again 3 weeks after that. And we're able to compare this experience to peer controls. We're able to compare it to traditional perspective-taking tasks, like reading in a vignette and imagining that you're a particular person. We're able to compare it to other forms of VR, right? There's a group of scholars who would argue you don't need these complex narratives. All you need to do is see your face in a mirror and move around in that body for a while, and your bias will decrease. Well, empirically, we can test whether there's some additional gain or some difference from taking this approach as opposed to a more simple embodiment approach. So what we've learned so far, and then I'll open it up for a few questions. When focused on social impact, the issue in the community that you're focused on should be your lead. It's not the technology, it's not what cool whizzy bang things you can do in VR, it's the people, issues, and communities you're trying to represent, and that, to me, that has to be at the center of your purpose and focus. Hot topics can be distracting from that purpose and intent. You should focus. This project has gotten a lot of buzz. People are interested in it. I think we could have done any little shitty thing, and some people would have been like, oh, racism, that's important. Let's, come give a talk. So it was important for us to remember what our intent was and what we really wanted to achieve. And also, I didn't write this, but also acknowledging that you can do damage to the communities you're trying to represent. It's not just a story, it's not just a piece. You can damage progress other people have made in a particular area. And many of us should be careful about when we're trying to tell a story that's not our own. What obligations do we have in representing other people's experiences and voices? I am Black, I am not all Black people, I am not a Black man. What are my obligations in respecting my limits in being able to tell this particular story? Iterate and be willing to completely shift gears. We started off one way. We're gonna do this, and we're gonna do that, and we're gonna do that. And 2 months in, we're like, that's not gonna work. We have to shift gears. We're on the wrong track here, and be willing to do that. Really focusing on the use of VR in this way, I think, as a tool for exploration, staying creative, staying open to the possibility. But it is not a magic pill that's gonna create high levels of empathy in all people, in all spaces, around all issues. We don't know that yet, and we should be really thoughtful and careful about how we're using the technology and what we think we're doing to people when we have them in the headset. And that your intention, I think our intentions are great, right? Let's fight racism. Let's increase people's commitment to issues of racial injustice. But that might not bear out in the data. It may not do what we wanted to do. Maybe we push people in the opposite direction. And as a scientist, I think that's important. And I think for creators in this space in general, it's important that we keep the possibility that we're not doing what we hoped we do in mind. And how do we then adjust and switch gears from that point? Thank you.